And how are we supposed to interpret this? As a simple and therefore empty threat from the Federation of Russia, or as an already fully formed plan, established and maybe even signed by the military leadership of that country, a mysterious map, mysterious yet revealing at the same time. It appeared right behind the chief of the general staff, Valery Gerasimov of the Russian Federation, while he was giving a press conference, with the detail that Gerasimov is an extremely private person. Even within the general staff, there are very few people who know any details about his life, even professionally, so those press conferences are rather minimal. And now, suddenly, he has decided to comment on the recent spring-summer campaign. Because as of September 1st, we have officially entered the fall-winter campaign. And before we continue, there's an absolutely key video that I have shared on my Telegram channel. Let me remind you, Liusibaya or our Liusibaya all together, just like the rest of my social media. You'll understand very well why it's here. Especially when we get to the end of this report and see the data on how many recruits Russia has, how much territory it controls as of today, and what the situation is in Ukraine. And the situation in Ukraine, in this video that you can find on my Telegram, you can clearly see a soldier from the armed forces of Ukraine, who is unarmed and half naked. From the waist up, he is walking with a white flag to surrender to the army of the Russian Federation. And the Russian drone is accompanying him so that he can safely cross those minefields and surrender securely. However, another drone arrives, this time Ukrainian, and ends up finishing him off and eliminating him from the battlefield. What's happening? That the Ukrainian soldiers are always absolutely clear, no matter what happens. They can't turn their backs on their own men who have basically come to give, to offer their lives, to lose them just like that. You'll see that immediately. Why do I say this? So that the Kiev regime can keep their seat. That being said, let's continue with the analysis. While he was making the statements in question, it turns out that right behind him appeared, well, it was just calmly hanging there, a map that, especially within the media space of the Russian Federation, caused a huge sensation. Practically from one moment to the next, because that's what people are saying, especially in Russia. But is that already crossing the borders of that country? That on the map in question, the regions of Odesa and Nikolaev appeared as part of the territory of the Russian Federation. That is, if we interpret it strictly, it could be that the future of the special military operation involves leaving Ukraine completely isolated and isolating it in several ways. On one hand, with no possibility of joining NATO, of course, this has already been confirmed by Donald Trump. Ukraine can't even dream of it. And on the other hand, leaving it without access to the sea. I mean, suddenly from being a country that had 2 seas, no more and no less, now it's left with just the Black Sea. But it could happen if Russia ends up liberating the territory of Odesa and Nikolaev within its borders, that Ukraine could be left without the Black Sea. And finally, Ukraine could tell you that it would be left without the European Union, but would it really be isolated? It could be that even with the European Union, but considering the place that the European Union holds internationally today, that's like being left with absolutely nothing. Because while we're now discussing matters of tremendous magnitude and importance in the European Union, they're just going on about Ursula von der Leyen, for example, recently, just a few hours ago, had to make an emergency stop in Bulgaria because her plane was the victim. What kind of interference has the Russian Federation created? Come on, the media that actually takes this information and presents it as if it had even the slightest bit of credibility. I think they should start using a giant tinfoil hat in their logos, because that's what they've come to at this point. However, the most important thing now is to clarify, and there are several details to discuss here to clarify if it's just a kind of bluff and a simple threat from Russia, or if it's really. This is part of a plan that has already been approved at the highest level. And here several issues need to be taken into account. First of all, Russia is a country with very few cities. That is contrary to what we usually see in the West. Neither the Russian president nor the ministers nor practically anyone goes out to make any kind of bombastic statements. And rather, it's a country that is characterized by acting first and commenting later. The Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, second detail, is an extremely closed organization. Even more so, as we already mentioned, is the chief of the Russian General Staff. And the thing is, not even when the most important advances are made, the Russian Ministry of Defense comments on them. At the moment, they always wait, they always take things with a lot of caution. And the third detail, this would fit extremely well with the message that has recently been sent from the diplomatic leadership of the Russian Federation. Because now we are talking about the military leadership, but the diplomatic leadership as well. When these negotiations between the Russian and Ukrainian delegations were recently held in Turkey, they already sent a very important message. And so Mr. Medinsky on the Russian side, the main negotiator, being a historian, in addition, he threw a very clear jab at Ukraine saying, "We were at war with Sweden for 21 years. Do you really want to be at war with us for 21 years? Because we are ready." That's the first message. But also, before that, there was another message when someone, a negotiator from that same delegation, told him, or could it be that even Medinsky himself told Ukraine, if today you don't want to sign peace with those 4 regions that Russia is claiming and has already included in its constitution, let me remind you. The People's Republics of Donetsk and Lugansk, as well as the regions of Kherson and Zaporozhye, could eventually end up being 6 regions. And well, we all think of Dnipropetrovsk and Sumy as clear possibilities, because that's where Russia has actually already started some offensive operations. It could also be the region of Kharkov, for example, but it could also be the regions of Odesa and Nikolaev, which would be much more difficult in military terms, but much more beneficial for the Russian Federation. And this is where we get to whether it's possible or impossible, because as long as Ukraine, and we were talking about this just yesterday during the live stream, when we did that sort of recap of the now finished spring-summer campaign, where, well, the Russian Federation's own Ministry of Defense, Gemat himself, precisely with that map behind him, said that Russia, in recent months, during this campaign, has come to control no less than 3,500 square kilometers of territory, 149 localities of varying importance and size. I'll add some other data that I think is extremely important, especially right now, since this information was updated at the time. Dmitry Medvedev in the year 2024, the Russian Federation signed contracts with no less than 450,000 volunteers, and to these you have to add about another 40,000 volunteers. The first group signed 3-year contracts, while the second group signed for 6 months. This happened in 2024 on May 28. 2025, that is this year, that's it. Dmitry Medvedev was talking about 175,000 contracts signed for 3 years, plus 14,000 contracts signed for 6 months. That is, the Russian Federation at this very moment does not have any shortage of volunteers. What's more, it is supplying its army in a very broad and forceful way. On the contrary, we have the images that I mentioned to you at the beginning of this report. A soldier from the armed forces of Ukraine eliminated by his own comrades so that others don't even have the slightest thought of fleeing the front. This is, of course, due to the absolutely critical situation where these so-called volunteers, as they say in Ukraine, are forcibly recruited on the streets. They don't want to fight, they want to surrender, but don't have that choice. How long will Ukraine hold out before the front collapses? And why? Hasn't he signed the Russian conditions yet? Because everything points to that. And here I'd love to know your opinion on whether it's just a bluff by Russia or if it's actually a plan that's already set up and very, very, very well organized. Why doesn't Ukraine sign the conditions for sure now? Are we talking about the regions of Odesa and Nikolaev or not mentioning them? We all know that today they could sign a much more beneficial peace than tomorrow. And of course, after some time, and the more time passes, the worse the peace conditions will end up being for Ukraine.